The history of the ancient kingdom of Boravia is one that stretches back into the misty annals of time, a tale so densely packed with monotonous detail that it has lulled generations of scholars into a deep and restful slumber, and it is here that we begin our exhaustive exploration of this singularly unremarkable civilization, which thrived, if one could call it that, in the fertile yet forgettable valleys between the melancholic mountains and the river Soper, a slow-moving body of water whose currents were as sluggish as the minds of the Boravian people, who dedicated their lives to the cultivation of turnips, a crop so bland that even their neighbors, the notoriously dull Drausians, refused to trade for them, forcing the Boravians to sustain themselves on an unvarying diet of boiled turnip mash, a substance so devoid of flavor that it became the subject of countless proverbs about endurance, such as, "Only a Boravian can eat turnips and still call it a meal," a saying that spread across the region as a testament to their unparalleled ability to tolerate tedium. And it was under these conditions that the Boravian society developed, if one could use such a dynamic term, into a rigidly structured hierarchy ruled by a line of kings whose names have been lost to history not because of any great catastrophe but simply because no one could be bothered to remember them, for their reigns were marked by an unbroken succession of uneventful years in which nothing of note occurred except the occasional dispute over turnip taxation, a matter so trivial that the scribes tasked with recording it often fell asleep mid-sentence, leaving behind scrolls filled with half-finished accounts of debates about crop yields, and thus the Boravian government, such as it was, operated in a state of perpetual drowsiness, with council meetings frequently adjourned due to the entire assembly having nodded off, a phenomenon so common that the royal decree, "Let them sleep," became the unofficial motto of the kingdom, and so life continued in this fashion for centuries, uninterrupted by war, innovation, or any form of excitement, as the Boravians perfected the art of existing without truly living, the greatest achievement being the invention of a particularly soft type of woolen sock, which, though comfortable, did little to alter the course of history, and thus we leave them for now, nestled in their valley, undisturbed by ambition or curiosity, a people so perfectly uninteresting that even the ghosts, it is said, haunt in silence, drifting through the turnip fields without a whisper, as the world around them marches forward, unburdened by the weight of their legacy. Chapter 2. The political structure of Boravia, if one could dignify it with such a term, was a marvel of inertia, a system so devoid of dynamism that even the most dedicated historians struggle to recount its features without succumbing to a profound sense of lethargy, and it is within this context that we must examine the Boravian Council of Elders, a body of governance so passive that its members were often mistaken for statues, their meetings conducted in a silence so deep that the only audible sound was the occasional snore of the court scribe, who had long since abandoned any pretense of recording minutes in favor of more restful pursuits, and the council's primary function, insofar as it had one, was to deliberate on matters of such staggering insignificance that the very act of discussion seemed to drain the life from those present, with topics ranging from the proper storage of dried turnips to the contentious debate over whether the royal insignia, a single wilted turnip leaf, should be embroidered in slightly darker green thread, a question that took 14 years to resolve, only to be forgotten immediately after the decision was made. Chapter 2. The political structure of Boravia, if one could dignify it with such a term, was a marvel of inertia, a system so devoid of dynamism that even the most dedicated historians struggle to recount its features without succumbing to a profound sense of lethargy, and it is within this context that we must examine the Boravian Council of Elders, a body of governance so passive that its members were often mistaken for statues, their meetings conducted in a silence so deep that the only audible sound was the occasional snore of the court scribe, who had long since abandoned any pretense of recording minutes in favor of more restful pursuits, and the council's primary function, insofar as it had one, was to deliberate on matters of such staggering insignificance that the very act of discussion seemed to drain the life from those present, with topics ranging from the proper storage of dried turnips to the contentious debate over whether the royal insignia, a single wilted turnip leaf, should be embroidered in slightly darker green thread, a question that took 14 years to resolve, only to be forgotten immediately after the decision was made, and the king himself, a figure so unremarkable that his portrait was often used as a remedy for insomnia, held no real power beyond the ceremonial duty of tasting the first turnip of the harvest, a privilege he performed with all the enthusiasm of a man condemned to eternal boredom, and yet the Boravians revered him, not for any particular virtue or achievement, but simply because they could not conceive of an alternative, the collective imagination having atrophied from centuries of intellectual stagnation, and so the monarchy persisted, a hollow institution propped up by tradition and the sheer inability of anyone to muster the energy to oppose it, while the common people, if they could be called such, lived lives of quiet resignation, their days marked by the slow turning of the seasons and the relentless cycle of turnip cultivation, a routine so unchanging that even the concept of rebellion never occurred to them, for what would they revolt against? The crushing weight of their own monotony. And thus the Boravian state endured, unchallenged and unaltered, its laws etched not in stone but in the collective drowsiness of its citizens, its greatest triumph being the absence of any event worth remembering. And so we leave this chapter as we began it, adrift in the sea of Boravian tedium, where time itself seems to slow to a crawl, and the very act of reading these words becomes a test of endurance, a journey into the heart of a civilization that perfected the art of being forgotten. Chapter 3. The cultural achievements of Boravia, if one could generously apply such a term to their meager output, were as unremarkable as the rest of their civilization, a fact best exemplified by their so-called great epic, a literary work so devoid of excitement that even its own scribes frequently abandoned its transcription midway, leaving behind fragments of a narrative that revolved entirely around the life cycle of a single turnip, from its humble germination in the dull brown soil of the kingdom's least fertile field to its eventual harvest, a moment described with such exhaustive detail that the passage alone could fill 3 scrolls without ever approaching anything resembling drama. And this epic, known formally as the Ballad of the Unsung Tuber *, was recited annually at the Festival of Subsistence, an event so poorly attended that the few souls who gathered to hear it often drifted into a collective slumber before the 3rd stanza, which painstakingly catalogued the various shades of brown observable in the turnip's skin. Under differing weather conditions, a subject that the Boravian bards, if they could be called such, delivered with a droning cadence designed to mimic the rhythmic scraping of a wooden plough through unyielding earth, and beyond this dubious literary masterpiece, Boravian art consisted primarily of murals depicting turnips in various states of growth, rendered with such lifeless precision that they were often mistaken for actual turnips left to rot upon the walls, while their music, a formless collection of hums and throat-clearing noises arranged in no particular order, was said to induce a trance-like state in listeners, though whether this was by design or simply a side effect of its overwhelming dullness remains a subject of debate among the handful of scholars who have risked their sanity to study it. And their architecture, if one could dignify their squat mud huts with such a term, followed a single unchanging design, with roofs that sagged under the weight of their own indifference and doorways so low that visitors were forced to stoop, a feature that the Boravians claimed was symbolic of humility but was more likely the result of their architects' inability to conceive of any variation in structure, and thus the cultural legacy of Boravia was one of utter forgettability, a void so profound that even time itself seemed to hesitate before inscribing their existence into history, leaving behind only the faintest imprint, like a whisper lost in the wind or a turnip left too long in the ground, destined to be swallowed by the earth without a trace. Chapter 4. The religious practices of the Boravians were as uninspired as every other facet of their society, centered around the worship of a deity known as Slumber, the god of stillness and mild discomfort, whose divine commandments included such thrilling directives as, "Thou shalt not stir unnecessarily," and, "Let all actions be performed at half speed," tenets that the Boravians followed with a devotion bordering on the fanatical, their temples little more than dimly lit chambers where the faithful gathered to sit in silence, occasionally punctuated by the ritual consumption of lukewarm turnip broth, a sacrament so bland that it was said to cleanse the soul by numbing the senses, and their high priests, elected based on their ability to remain motionless for weeks at a time, delivered sermons in a whisper so faint that even the most attentive congregants often missed them entirely, though this was of little consequence since the messages invariably revolved around the virtues of patience and the sacred duty to avoid any form of excitement, with the occasional parable about a particularly uninteresting rock or a leaf that fell from a tree without making a sound, and their most sacred holiday, the day of unobserved passing, was celebrated by doing absolutely nothing, a tradition upheld with such rigor that historians still debate whether the holiday actually existed or was merely a rumor started by a Boravian who lacked the energy to confirm it, and their afterlife, known as the Great Yawn, was envisioned as an endless expanse of featureless gray where souls sat in perfect stillness, undisturbed by joy or sorrow, a fate that the Boravians found deeply comforting, for it mirrored the existence they had always known, and thus their faith persisted unchallenged for centuries, its rituals unchanged, its doctrines unquestioned, its followers content in their collective apathy, their prayers little more than sighs lost in the quiet hum of the wind. Chapter 5. The economic system of Boravia was a masterpiece of stagnation, a marvel of inertia so perfectly designed to discourage any form of productivity that it remains a case study in how a society can function, if one can call it functioning, without any discernible wealth, trade, or innovation, built entirely upon the cultivation and distribution of turnips, a crop so devoid of economic potential that neighboring kingdoms refused to engage in commerce with Boravia not out of hostility but sheer lack of interest, forcing the Boravians to sustain their entire civilization through a closed-loop system where turnips were harvested, boiled into a flavorless paste, and then consumed in a cycle so monotonous that even the most dedicated economists would struggle to find any meaningful fluctuations in supply or demand, and the concept of currency was entirely foreign to them, replaced instead by a barter system where goods and services were exchanged based on the principle of mutual indifference, with transactions conducted in such slow motion that many deals were abandoned before completion simply because both parties lost the will to continue, and their marketplaces, such as they were, consisted of a single square where vendors sat behind meager displays of turnips, their faces blank with resignation, their voices too weary to even call out prices, leaving customers to take what they wanted in exchange for whatever they happened to be carrying, though most often the only items exchanged were slightly different varieties of turnips, leading to a form of commerce so circular that it effectively cancelled itself out, and the few attempts at introducing new goods, such as the infamous woolen turnip sack, a failed innovation that aimed to keep turnips warm during storage, were met with such profound disinterest that they faded into obscurity almost immediately, leaving no trace in the historical record beyond a single half-finished ledger entry that simply read, "Tried something new. Regret it," and thus the Boravian economy persisted in a state of perfect equilibrium, where nothing was ever gained, nothing was ever lost, and the only measure of success was the ability to endure another day without expending unnecessary energy, a philosophy that permeated every transaction, every harvest, every waking moment, ensuring that the kingdom remained forever insulated from the chaos of progress, a relic of inertia in a world that had long since moved on. Chapter 6. The military history of Boravia was, unsurprisingly, a non-history, a void where one might expect tales of conquest or defense but instead found only an unbroken record of strategic napping. Their army, if such a term could be applied to a group of individuals who had collectively never raised a weapon in anger, consisting of a dozen elderly men who held the honorary title of Watchers of the Border, a duty they performed by sitting in a small hut near the edge of the kingdom and taking turns dozing, their primary responsibility being to occasionally glance toward the horizon and confirm that no threat was approaching, a task they accomplished with such lethargy that on the rare occasion a foreign scout did wander near, they were often mistaken for a mirage or a particularly persistent shrub, and the Boravian martial philosophy was best summarized by their sole military treatise, The Art of Not Being Noticed*, a scroll that contained exactly one sentence, "Stand very still and hope they go away," a strategy that had, against all odds, succeeded for centuries, as even the most ambitious invaders found themselves so drained of motivation upon entering Boravian territory that they inevitably abandoned their campaigns in favor of a long nap, and their weapons, if they could be called such, were repurposed farming tools, most notably the turnip cudgel, a club so ineffective that it was more likely to crumble upon impact than to harm an opponent, and their armor, crafted from layered turnip sacks. provided no protection whatsoever but did exude a faint earthy odor that was said to have a calming effect on both wearer and adversary alike. And the greatest battle, if it could be dignified with such a term, was the infamous skirmish of Yawning Hollow, a conflict that began when a neighboring kingdom's patrol accidentally crossed into Boravian territory and ended when both sides, after a full day of standing motionless and staring at one another in silence, mutually decided to abandon the encounter due to sheer exhaustion, a victory the Boravians celebrated by taking an extra long nap, and thus their military legacy was one of unparalleled pacifism, not out of any moral conviction but simply because the effort required to wage war was too great, leaving them to exist in a state of perpetual neutrality, undisturbed and undisturbing, a kingdom so harmless that even history forgot to conquer it. Chapter 7. The intellectual pursuits of Boravia represented not so much a flowering of the mind as a slow withering into obscurity, a gradual dimming of cognitive activity so profound that later civilizations would study their few remaining scrolls not for wisdom but as cautionary tales against the perils of unchecked tedium, their philosophers specializing in questions so devoid of urgency that even pondering them induced a trance-like state, with debates such as, if a turnip falls in an empty field and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Occupying entire generations of thinkers who would often pass away mid-contemplation, their faces frozen in expressions of mild confusion, and the greatest scientific achievement was the classification of 17 distinct types of soil ennui, a system so granular in its pointlessness that even the scribes tasked with recording it would frequently abandon their work to stare blankly at walls, while their mathematicians devoted their lives to calculating the exact number of turnips that could theoretically fit inside a theoretically infinite storage pit, a problem they never solved because the act of counting past 3 inevitably triggered an overwhelming urge to nap, and their medical knowledge was limited to a single axiom: rest cures all, applied uniformly to every ailment from minor scrapes to mortal illnesses with equal solemnity, resulting in a population that died at roughly the same rate as any other civilization but did so far more quietly, their last words usually a sigh or an unfinished thought about the weather, and their educational system, such as it was, consisted of elderly villagers mumbling folktales about moderately successful turnip harvests of yesteryear to children who had already mastered the art of sleeping with their eyes open, ensuring that each generation inherited not knowledge but a profound sense of resignation, a quiet understanding that curiosity was not so much discouraged as rendered impossible by the sheer weight of collective apathy pressing down upon them like an eternal, invisible fog, and thus Boravian thought progressed in the same way their river Sopa flowed, without direction, without purpose, and with a current so weak that it barely qualified as movement at all, leaving behind no ripples, no traces, only the faint impression that something had once been there, if one squinted hard enough in the right light, or perhaps just imagined it. Chapter 8. The eventual decline of Boravia was less a collapse than a gradual evaporation, a slow fading from existence so unremarkable that contemporary chroniclers in neighboring kingdoms failed to notice it had happened at all, the once sturdy mud huts dissolving back into the earth with a sigh, the last few turnip fields surrendering to weeds without protest, and the final generations of Boravians simply sitting down one day and never getting back up, their bodies merging seamlessly with the landscape as if they had always been part of it, their absence unmarked by mourning or monument, for who was left to remember them? The river Sopa, now barely a trickle, continued its sleepy course unchanged, the melancholic mountains stood as indifferent as ever, and the wind passed through the empty valley without so much as a whisper, carrying away the last traces of a people who had perfected the art of leaving no trace, their entire civilization reduced to a handful of half-rotted scrolls buried in the ruins of what might have been a library or might just have been a slightly larger than average hut, the ink faded to near invisibility, the words themselves seeming to dissolve upon contact with the air, as if even they lacked the conviction to endure, and so Boravia slipped from history not with a bang or a whimper but with a silence so deep it might never have broken at all, a kingdom built on tedium returning at last to the void from which it came, unmourned, unstudied, and utterly, profoundly forgotten, as though it had all been a particularly uneventful dream from which the world had already awakened. Epilogue. Centuries later, a lone traveler passing through the valley would pause, struck by an inexplicable urge to nap, and as his eyelids grew heavy he might, just for a moment, imagine faint voices murmuring about turnips in the breeze, or catch a whiff of something earthy and bland on the air, but the feeling would pass as quickly as it came, leaving no memory behind, and he would continue on his way, unaware that he had walked through a graveyard without tombstones, a kingdom without legacy, a story so dull it had erased itself from the world entirely, as though it had never been told at all. Chapter 9. The archaeological rediscovery that nobody asked for. Some 12 centuries after the last Boravian sighed into oblivion, a team of profoundly misguided archaeologists from the University of Tomsk stumbled upon the valley while searching for literally anything else, their initial excitement at discovering potential settlement patterns quickly giving way to a creeping existential dread as the sheer scale of Boravian nothingness became apparent. The dig site yielded exactly 3 artifacts of note: a spoon so worn down from generations of stirring turnip mush that it had become a mere sliver of its former self, a single clay tablet bearing the half-finished sentence, "The weather continues to be," and what appeared to be a ceremonial robe until closer inspection revealed it was just 7 ordinary tunics worn simultaneously by someone who clearly couldn't be bothered to change clothes. The team's lead researcher, Professor Emil Vortigern, famously published his findings under the title, "A Civilization That Should Have Stayed Buried," in the Journal of Forgettable Antiquities *, where his groundbreaking thesis, that Boravia represented the anthropological equivalent of a shrug, was met with unprecedented indifference even by academic standards. Local museums briefly debated exhibiting the artifacts before realizing visitors would pay good money to not see them, and the entire collection was eventually stored in a basement archive in Tomsk where they continue to gather dust at a rate that would have made the Boravians proud. Chapter 10. Boravia's unexpected cultural revival and equally swift abandonment ***. In a bizarre twist that defied all logic, Boravia briefly became a fashionable topic among certain circles of avant-garde intellectuals in the 19th century, its very nothingness reinterpreted as a radical rejection of modernity's oppressive dynamism. Salon goers in powdered wigs staged Boravian evenings, where guests competed to see who could sit in silence the longest while nibbling on deliberately undercooked root vegetables, and a particularly pretentious composer premiered his Symphony in B-flat boring to an audience that mostly used the performance as an opportunity to catch up on sleep. This revival reached its absurd peak when the Grand Duke of Ostlich commissioned a Boravian garden, featuring 17 identical plots of turnips arranged in what the landscape architect insisted was a profound commentary on stasis, though visitors universally reported feeling dumber after viewing it. The fad collapsed almost as quickly as it began when a journalist pointed out that trying to be deliberately Boravian was fundamentally missing the point, like shouting about the virtues of silence, and the entire movement dissolved in a wave of embarrassed recriminations, leaving behind only a few ruined dinner party reputations and several warehouses full of unsold, Boravian revival, turnip-themed pottery that to this day occasionally surfaces in flea markets to confuse collectors. Chapter 11. Modern Boravian Studies, or lack thereof, ***. The academic field of Boravian studies currently consists of exactly 1 tenured professor, University of Lesser Wessex, 2 graduate students who regret their life choices, and a departmental budget roughly equivalent to what most institutions spend on printer paper. Their annual conference, held in a different motel chain each year to avoid building traditions, typically features 3 attendees and a keynote address that's been the same since 1987, re-examining the turnip, new perspectives on old questions that nobody was asking. The field's most heated debate revolves around whether Boravia qualifies as a post-civilization, or simply a pre-civilization that got stuck, a discussion that inevitably ends with all participants agreeing to table the matter until next year. They never do. Recent attempts to apply computational analysis to Boravian artifacts yielded the groundbreaking discovery that their pottery patterns were statistically indistinguishable from random chance, while a much-hyped DNA study revealed the modern population most closely related to Boravians is, in a twist that surprised absolutely no one, the current residents of the valley, who still grow turnips and still don't care why anyone would study them. The sole remaining Boravian studies journal, Turnip Quarterly *, survives by occasionally publishing parody articles that the editors can't tell apart from real scholarship, and its most cited paper remains 1993's Why We Should Stop Writing About Boravia, which, ironically, spawned 57 response articles. Chapter 12, The Curious Case of the Boravian Golden Age, that probably didn't exist. Among the few fragmentary records that survived Boravia's descent into oblivion was a single crumbling scroll, now reduced to little more than a brittle strip of stained vellum, that made passing reference to something called the Great Awakening, a period allegedly marked by what the scribe, whose name has been lost, though the handwriting suggests they were either very old or very tired, described as unprecedented activity, a phrase so shockingly out of character for Boravian historiography that later scholars spent decades debating whether it was a transcription error, an elaborate joke, or evidence of some catastrophic but blessedly brief interruption to the kingdom's normal state of lethargy. The scroll claimed that during this mysterious epoch, no fewer than 3 new varieties of turnip were cultivated, though all were described as marginally less bitter, rather than actually good. A second story was added to the royal hut, which collapsed immediately under its own weight, killing the royal architect, who was posthumously declared a visionary for his bold attempt at verticality, and, most astonishing of all, someone briefly considered building a bridge across the river Soper before realizing the opposite bank contained nothing of interest. Modern carbon dating suggests this so-called Golden Age lasted approximately 14 months before the Boravians collectively decided it wasn't worth the effort and reverted to their traditional state of mild catatonia, though not before inscribing a single commemorative stele that read, in its entirety, "We tried." Regrets were had. Excavations at the alleged site of this renaissance uncovered a thin layer of slightly less compacted dirt between sedimentary strata of profound normalcy, along with a single rusted hoe that might have been used with slightly more vigor than usual before being abandoned mid-swing. The current academic consensus holds that if this awakening did occur, it was almost certainly accidental, and likely caused by a brief contamination of the water supply with some unknown stimulant that later filtered out of the ecosystem, though a vocal minority maintains it was simply a collective fever dream that the entire civilization briefly mistook for reality before wisely returning to their senses. Chapter 13, Boravian Foreign Relations, or lack thereof, ****. The kingdom's interactions with neighboring states were characterized by what modern diplomats might call aggressive disengagement, a policy so effective that several contemporary maps simply omitted Boravia entirely, assuming the blank space to be a cartographic error rather than an actual nation. On the rare occasions when foreign envoys attempted contact, they were met with what one frustrated emissary from the Kingdom of Varus described as a wall of quiet disapproval masquerading as hospitality, his trade delegation having been welcomed with a 12-hour silent vigil followed by a feast consisting of unseasoned turnip water served at room temperature. The Boravian approach to border disputes, which consisted of slowly retreating inward until the invaders grew bored and left, proved unexpectedly effective, their territory gradually shrinking like a drying stain without a single drop of bloodshed. Records from the neighboring Drausian Empire mention sending 3 separate military expeditions to conquer Boravia, all of which failed when the troops, deprived of any meaningful resistance or even acknowledgement of their presence, simply sat down and forgot why they'd come. The sole surviving Boravian diplomatic correspondence is a single clay tablet bearing the imprint of a face, presumed to be their version of a formal treaty, though whether this signified surrender, alliance, or someone having fallen asleep on important documents remains hotly debated by the handful of scholars who haven't yet given up on making sense of the civilization. What little cross-cultural exchange did occur flowed entirely one way, with Boravia absorbing exactly 0 foreign innovations except for one memorable incident where a traveling merchant's donkey, left unattended, ate several turnips and promptly died, an event the Boravians commemorated as the Great Tragedy, for precisely 1 generation before forgetting about it entirely. Chapter 14, The Boravian Calendar System, or Why Time Itself Struggled Here, ****. While other ancient civilizations measured years by royal dynasties or celestial events, Boravia developed a chronology so deliberately uneventful that it essentially constituted a form of temporal camouflage. Their calendar divided time into units called yawns, approximately 7 hours, size, 3 to 5 days, and the ominously named Great Blinks, which could last anywhere from a month to a decade depending on how motivated the timekeepers felt. Historical records were dated using turnip harvest quality as reference points, leading to designations like the slightly less barren year, or that one autumn where the tubers were unusually symmetrical. The kingdom famously refused to adopt leap days on the grounds that extra time was the last thing they needed, and their astronomers, if one can call them that, dismissed eclipses as showy celestial nonsense, unworthy of observation. This system reached its logical conclusion when the Boravian chronicles simply stopped marking years altogether around the 14th century BCE, transitioning to an undated account that read, in part, things continued much as they had before, and will likely keep doing so until they don't, at which point whoever's still awake can make a note of it. Modern attempts to reconstruct Boravian timelines have all ended the same way, with researchers developing thousand-yard stares and a newfound appreciation for coffee, leading most historians to simply declare the entire civilization effectively outside of time, and move on to studying cultures that at least had the decency to build inconveniently large stone structures. Chapter 15. Boravian funeral customs, or lack thereof, ****. Death in Boravia was treated with the same quiet indifference as every other aspect of life, their funeral practices consisting mainly of waiting to see if the deceased would get back up, and when they didn't, shrugging and going back to whatever one was doing before. Corpses were interred in unmarked turnip fields under the theory that they might as well be useful for something, a practice that led to the kingdom's only known export, extremely depressed-looking carrots that tasted vaguely of existential resignation. Mourning periods were theoretically observed but frequently forgotten partway through, and the closest thing Boravia had to an afterlife belief was the vague notion that the dead were probably somewhere less interesting now. Their sole funerary monument, a moss-covered rock with the word "gone" scratched into it, was later discovered to have been repurposed from an earlier attempt at a sundial that failed because nobody could be bothered to move it throughout the day. Modern archaeologists excavating Boravian burial sites have noted the complete absence of grave goods except for one peculiar find, a skeleton clutching a single die that, upon closer inspection, turned out to have no pips on any side, a metaphor so perfect it made several PhD students quit anthropology altogether. The Boravian approach to mortality is perhaps best summarized by their only recorded elegy, which consisted of the phrase, "Well, that happened," repeated 12 times at gradually decreasing volume until the speaker wandered off to take a nap. Chapter 16. The Myth of the Last Boravian and Why It Doesn't Matter ****. Folklore in the surrounding regions occasionally speaks of a final Boravian who supposedly lingered in the valley long after their civilization had faded, a lonely figure shuffling between empty huts and whispering to turnips that would never be harvested. This sentimental tale, almost certainly invented by romantic poets who'd never actually visited the area, contradicts everything known about Boravian culture, which valued collective apathy too highly to permit such dramatic individualism. More reliable accounts suggest the kingdom didn't so much end as taper off, like a sentence that trails into silence because the speaker couldn't be bothered to finish it. The last Boravian was probably just some shepherd from a neighboring village who happened to be exceptionally dull, his reputation growing in retrospect like a mold culture on forgotten bread. What little evidence exists points to the civilization's final act being characteristically anticlimactic. A half-eaten bowl of turnip mush abandoned mid-meal, a door left slightly ajar because closing it required too much effort, the faint impression of bodies having sat in the same spot for so long that the earth remembered them even after their bones had turned to dust. They leave no unanswered questions except perhaps one: why anyone would bother wondering about them in the first place. Chapter 17. Boravia's Final Secret Which Isn't Worth Discovering ****. In 1987, A team of archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar discovered an anomalous chamber beneath the presumed site of the Boravian royal compound, a hollow space that defied the civilization's usual architectural minimalism. After years of bureaucratic delays, during which several grant committees fell asleep during funding presentations, the site was finally excavated to reveal a single empty room containing exactly three things: a chair that looked uncomfortable in every conceivable position, a wall carving of what might have been a turnip or possibly just a lazy circle, and, most baffling of all, a small clay tablet bearing the inscription, "We were here." Sort of. The discovery sparked brief excitement before scholars realized this was peak Boravian humor, building a secret chamber just to disappoint anyone who found it. The room's true purpose remains unknown, though the leading theory suggests it was either a failed attempt at a thinking space, abandoned when thinking proved too strenuous, or the world's least inspiring time capsule. The chair collapsed when touched, the carving flaked away upon exposure to air, and the tablet now resides in a museum basement where it serves as the perfect paperweight for studies nobody will ever read. In the end, even Boravia's big reveal turned out to be exactly what should have been expected: nothing much. Chapter 18. The weather in Boravia, a subject that somehow fills 27 scrolls, ***. While most civilizations recorded wars, births of kings, and celestial phenomena, Boravian scribes dedicated an inexplicable amount of parchment to documenting cloud formations with the enthusiasm of people who had never seen weather before. Their archives contain exhaustive accounts of partly cloudy with a chance of more clouds later, and that one time it drizzled but not enough to warrant concern, each observation recorded in painstaking detail that somehow managed to be both overly specific and utterly devoid of useful information. The infamous Great Rain Debate Scroll, which spans 42 feet of vellum, documents a two-decade argument over whether a particular shower in 1342 BCE, estimated date, the scribes couldn't be bothered to mark years consistently, had been unusually damp, or just typically damp, a controversy that allegedly caused the only known instance of Boravian civil unrest when three elders sighed louder than usual at a council meeting. Modern meteorologists have attempted to mine these records for climate data, only to conclude that Boravia's weather was as unremarkable as everything else about it, a perfect equilibrium of mild discomfort occasionally punctuated by the sort of breezes that make doors creak just enough to be annoying but not enough to justify fixing them. The sole exception was the so-called Great Wind of 1221 BCE, probably, which toppled exactly one fence post and was commemorated in a surprisingly vivid mural that depicted several Boravians, slightly more hunched over than usual as they walked against the breeze. Climate historians now refer to this as peak Boravian drama. Chapter 19. Boravian childrearing practices, or how to raise a generation that asks zero questions, ***. Education in Boravia began at birth, if one could call it education, with newborns being immediately introduced to the kingdom's core cultural values through a ritual known as the first sigh, where infants were placed on a bed of turnip leaves and gently ignored until they stopped crying from lack of attention. Childhood consisted mainly of learning three essential skills: how to sit without fidgeting, how to chew turnips quietly, and how to respond to any query with a non-committal grunt that could be interpreted as either affirmation or denial depending on the listener's preference. Boravian parents took pride in raising children who could sleep upright like horses and whose emotional range spanned from mild hunger to vague discomfort. The closest thing to toys found by archaeologists are small lumps of clay that may have been dolls or may have just been lumps of clay someone couldn't be bothered to throw away. Adolescence wasn't so much a phase as it was the moment when young Boravians realized nothing interesting would ever happen to them and adjusted their expectations accordingly. The sole surviving childrearing manual, if one can call it that, consists of a single piece of bark with the words, "They'll figure it out," scratched into it, which archaeologists initially mistook for profound wisdom before realizing it was literally just that. By all accounts, the system worked perfectly, producing generation after generation of citizens who never once wondered if there might be more to life than what they had, a legacy of contentment through lowered expectations that modern parenting experts refuse to study on principle. Chapter 20. The Boravian Language, a study in how few sounds are actually necessary for communication, ***. Linguists still argue about whether Boravian qualifies as a true language or merely an elaborate system of passive-aggressive throat clearing. With only 14 confirmed phonemes, including the controversial HHRRNK sound that may have been a word or possibly just a symptom of chronic turnip indigestion, it managed to convey an astonishing range of meaning through subtle variations in side duration and eyebrow positioning. Written Boravian used an alphabet of just 9 characters, 6 of which were different types of straight lines, resulting in texts that looked like someone had absent-mindedly dragged a stick through mud while thinking about something else. The language's most distinctive feature was its implied subtext, where the true meaning of any statement was understood to be the exact opposite of whatever required the least effort to say. For example, the phrase, "the turnips are adequate," could contextually mean anything from, "we're all going to starve," to, "I've decided to abandon my family and live as a hermit," depending largely on how much sunlight the speaker had gotten that morning. Modern attempts at translation have largely failed because, as one frustrated linguist put it, you can't decode apathy. The sole Boravian word to enter other languages was learn, a term that simultaneously means yes, no, and I can't be bothered to care, and which remains popular in certain bureaucratic circles to this day. What little poetry survived consists mainly of lists of farm implements read in descending order of usefulness, though some scholars argue these might actually have been grocery lists. The language died out not with a bang but with a shrug, its last speakers forgetting mid-sentence what they were talking about and deciding it wasn't important anyway. Chapter 21. Boravian Fashion, or How to Make Sackcloth Look Like a Philosophical Statement, ***. Clothing in Boravia followed one simple principle. If it couldn't be made by folding a single piece of undyed fabric around the body and securing it with a piece of twine found on the ground, it wasn't worth wearing. The textile industry consisted mainly of waiting for sheep to shed naturally and then vaguely gesturing at the wool until it resembled something that could legally be called a garment. The Boravian color palette, if one could call it that, ranged from dirt to slightly darker dirt, with the occasional adventurous soul sporting a muted beige that qualified as scandalously flamboyant. Footwear was considered an unnecessary affectation except during winter, when everyone wore the same style of shapeless felt boot that somehow managed to be simultaneously too tight and too loose. Jewelry consisted of small, unremarkable stones tied around the neck with string, not as decoration, but as a practical reminder of where one's neck was in case it needed scratching. The closest thing to fashion innovation was the reversible tunic, which was identical on both sides because turning it inside out required too much effort. Excavated graves show no variation in clothing across social classes except that wealthier Boravians were buried with slightly more patches on their patches. When foreign fabrics occasionally made their way into the kingdom through trade accidents, they were either used as emergency roofing or left to rot quietly in storage, the general consensus being that, if the turnips don't care what they look like, why should we? Modern attempts to recreate Boravian clothing for historical reenactments inevitably fail when the actors, after wearing the outfits for more than 20 minutes, develop an overwhelming urge to sit down and give up on life. Chapter 22. Boravian Holidays, or How to Celebrate Without Exertion, ***. The Boravian calendar featured exactly 5 annual observances, all of which were essentially the same event with slightly different names: the Festival of Minimal Effort, spring; the Day of Slight Repose, summer; the Evening of Moderate Silence, autumn; the Hour of Passive Reflection, winter; and, most anticipated of all, the moment when someone remembered to check if the turnips were still there, date variable. Celebrations consisted mainly of doing marginally less work than usual while vaguely acknowledging that this made the day technically different from others. The closest thing to revelry was the tradition of soft humming, where participants would emit a single monotone note until they forgot what they were doing, a practice that often blended seamlessly into regular daily life. Gifts were never exchanged because that would require both thought and movement, though it was considered polite to occasionally glance in someone's general direction for slightly longer than necessary. The most controversial holiday in Boravian history was the short-lived Festival of Almost Doing Something, which was abandoned after its inaugural year when participants realized preparing for it required standing up more than twice in one day. Modern anthropologists note that Boravian holidays perfectly embodied their worldview, marking the passage of time without actually doing anything to commemorate it, like a clock that ticks but refuses to chime. Chapter 23: Boravian Architecture, or How to Build Structures That Actively Discourage Existence ****. The Boravian approach to construction could be summarized as, if it hasn't collapsed yet, it's probably fine. Their buildings followed three universal principles. Roofs should leak just enough to be annoying but not enough to justify repairs. Doorways should be low enough to force visitors into a posture of resigned submission, and walls should be thick enough to muffle sound but thin enough to ensure no one ever felt truly alone with their thoughts. The famed architectural scrolls of Boravia, actually just a series of stick figures shrugging next to vaguely hut-shaped doodles, suggest their builders viewed structural integrity as more of a suggestion than a requirement. Excavations reveal foundations that appear to have been dug by people who lost interest halfway through, and mortar mixed with what modern chemists have identified as probably some dirt they found nearby. The royal palace, if one could call it that, differed from peasant huts only in having a second room that no one ever used because getting to it required walking around an inconveniently placed support beam. Their sole architectural innovation was the load-bearing sigh, a technique where buildings remained upright not through engineering but through sheer lack of motivation to fall over. When structures did eventually collapse, as they all inevitably did, the standard Boravian response was to slowly blink at the rubble for several days before beginning to rebuild in exactly the same spot using exactly the same flawed methods, a cycle that continued for centuries without anyone ever questioning why. Modern engineers studying Boravian ruins report an overwhelming urge to take naps mid-analysis, leading some to speculate the buildings were designed to transmit lethargy through the very stones. Chapter 24: Boravian Medicine, or How to Cure Diseases by Pretending They Don't Exist ****. The Boravian approach to healthcare was simplicity itself. If an ailment wasn't immediately fatal, it wasn't worth treating, and if it was immediately fatal, it was too late to bother. Their medical texts, what few survived, consist mainly of drawings of frowning faces next to the word "don't" in various handwriting styles. Excavated healers' huts contain exactly two types of artifacts: unused herbal bundles that analysis reveals to be ordinary weeds, and small clay discs that may have been used for diagnosis or possibly just as makeshift coasters. The Boravian theory of disease held that all illnesses were caused by excessive vitality, and thus the best treatment was to lie very still until either the body forgot it was sick or the patient forgot they had a body. Their most advanced surgical procedure was waiting to see if it falls off on its own, a technique still employed in certain bureaucratic healthcare systems today. Childbirth was handled with characteristic Boravian pragmatism. Mothers were expected to just get on with it, while everyone else in the village pretended not to notice unless something went catastrophically wrong, at which point they'd sigh heavily before going back to whatever they'd been doing. The civilization's average lifespan was actually comparable to its contemporaries, not because their medicine worked but because their lifestyle was so devoid of stress or exertion that most major diseases couldn't be bothered to take hold. Modern researchers note that the only condition Boravian medicine effectively cured was hope, a side effect that patients were expected to embrace as a feature rather than a bug. Chapter 25: Boravian Sports and Recreation, an oxymoron in practice ****. Physical activity in Boravia was viewed with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for root canal surgery performed by a blindfolded bear. Their so-called games included such thrilling pastimes as seeing who could sit the longest without adjusting position, and the infamous turnip stare, where competitors would gaze at a single root vegetable until someone blinked or forgot what they were doing. Matches could last for days. The closest thing to a popular sport was mild shuffling, a team activity where participants would half-heartedly move between vaguely defined goals before collectively deciding it wasn't worth the effort and lying down instead. Equipment consisted mainly of sticks that had fallen naturally from trees and rocks that were already conveniently positioned on the ground, the Boravians considering it poor form to exert oneself by picking things up. Their Olympic equivalent, the Somnolympics, featured events like competitive yawning, synchronized sitting, and the 1mm dash, often cancelled when no one showed up at the starting line. Winners received a slightly larger portion of that day's turnip ration, a prize most immediately traded away for the privilege of being left alone. Modern kinesiologists studying these athletic traditions report unprecedented drops in heart rate among test subjects attempting to replicate them, with several study participants falling asleep mid-experiment. The Boravians' greatest sporting achievement was undoubtedly their perfect record of never having a single injury in competition, a feat accomplished by never actually moving enough to risk harm. Chapter 26, Boravian Music, or How to Make Silence Seem Loud by Comparison, ****. The musical traditions of Boravia challenged the very definition of what could be called sound. Their instruments included the drone flute, a hollow reed that produced a single pitch indistinguishable from wind passing through a crack, the mumble drum, a stretched hide played so softly it may as well have not been struck at all, and the controversial, not a fiddle, which most archaeologists believe was never actually played but just carried around for appearances. Their scales consisted of two notes, one slightly flatter than the other, played in rhythms that mirrored the irregular breathing of someone on the verge of sleep. Boravian compositions had titles like Variations on a Theme No One Could Remember, and The Song That Might As Well Not Exist, with lyrics, when present, mainly consisting of lists of household objects recited in descending order of usefulness. Their national anthem, preserved on a single wax cylinder that later turned out to be defective, was 3 minutes of someone breathing through their nose followed by what might have been a cough or possibly a failed attempt at percussion. Musicologists still argue whether Boravian performances were meant to be heard or was simply elaborate performance art about the futility of expression. The civilization's sole musical innovation was the development of anti-harmony, a technique where notes were carefully arranged to cancel each other out, resulting in a silence more profound than nature could achieve on its own, a metaphor so perfect it made several visiting bards from neighboring kingdoms retire on the spot. Chapter 27, The Boravian Concept of Love, or Lack Thereof, ****. Romance in Boravia was a subdued affair, best described as the careful avoidance of strong feelings between two people who couldn't be bothered to avoid each other. Courtship rituals consisted mainly of standing near someone for several years until both parties gradually assumed they were probably married now. The Boravian language had no word for passion, though it did have 14 subtly different terms for mild tolerance. Wedding ceremonies were brief affairs where couples would exchange identical lumps of clay, symbolizing something, before returning to their separate huts to think about what they'd just done. Divorce was unheard of, not because marriages were happy, but because filing the paperwork required getting up. Their concept of beauty centered on qualities like being unlikely to cause trouble, and having a face that didn't demand attention, with the most sought-after trait being the ability to sit quietly for hours without making noise. Love poetry, what little existed, read like grocery lists with occasional rhymes, as in the famous verse, "Your eyes are like turnips but slightly less round, I suppose you'll do, now please don't make a sound." Modern analysis of Boravian relationships suggests they achieved a kind of perfect equilibrium, partners neither happy nor unhappy, simply existing in parallel like two rocks slowly eroding in the same unremarkable stream. Chapter 28, Boravian Concept of Time, or How to Make Eternity Feel Brief, ****. While other ancient cultures developed elaborate calendar systems tracking celestial cycles and agricultural seasons, the Boravians measured time in units called mares, roughly equivalent to however long it takes to stop caring about whatever just happened. Their clocks, when they bothered with them, were sundials deliberately placed in shadow or hourglasses filled with sand so coarse it barely trickled. The Boravian week had one day, called today. Their month was however long it's been since someone mentioned the moon, and their year was marked only by the grudging acknowledgement that the turnips weren't going to harvest themselves. Historical records use relative dating like, shortly after that unremarkable rainfall, or, around the time Elder Grump stopped talking mid-sentence and never started again. This system reached its logical conclusion when scholars realized the Boravians had somehow missed an entire century because no one noticed when the long count calendar rolled over, an event that would have been accompanied by great fanfare in other cultures but in Boravia warranted only a single scribbled note that read, "Digits got stuck, might fix later." Modern physicists studying Boravian timekeeping report disturbing phenomena: clocks slowing down when near artifacts, researchers experiencing lost hours after reading certain scrolls, leading some to speculate the civilization accidentally discovered how to stretch moments into eternities through sheer apathy. The ultimate proof of the temporal mastery. These chapters about Boravia feel infinitely longer than the civilization actually lasted. Chapter 29. The Boravian concept of self, or how to achieve enlightenment by not bothering, ****. Boravian philosophy's central tenet was that thinking too hard about existence was the first step toward disappointment, a belief system now known to scholars as apathetic nihilism. Their meditative practices involved staring at walls until one forgot what one was meditating about, achieving a state of perfect mental blankness they called the Great Whatever. The closest thing to a spiritual text was a single clay tablet that read, "I am," more or less, before trailing off into what might have been a doodle or possibly just a crack in the material. Their creation myth claimed the world emerged when the primordial deity Slumber couldn't be bothered to keep nothingness going anymore, while their eschatology predicted the universe would end when everyone finally stops paying attention. Boravian monks, if one could call them that, took vows of mild inconvenience rather than poverty or chastity, their monasteries being places where people went to be slightly more uncomfortable than usual while contemplating the futility of contemplation. Modern psychologists note that Boravians achieved what Eastern mystics spend lifetimes pursuing: complete detachment from desire, not through discipline but through sheer lack of initiative. The greatest philosophical achievement was proving that enlightenment could be attained by anyone willing to lower their standards enough. Chapter 30. The Boravian legacy, which is to have none at all, ****. In the end, Boravia's greatest accomplishment was its complete lack of accomplishments, a civilization that perfected the art of leaving no trace. While other kingdoms built monuments to the glory, Boravia constructed monuments to, well, actually they didn't construct anything, which in its own way was even more impressive. Modern attempts to find meaning in their existence inevitably circle back to the same conclusion: there wasn't any. They fought no great wars because no one could be bothered, produced no art worth seeing because nothing was worth looking at, and developed no technologies because innovation required effort. Their historical impact is measured not in artifacts or ideas but in the sheer vacuum they left behind, a negative space so perfect it becomes its own kind of presence. Archaeologists still dig through Boravian sites not because they expect to find anything important, but because the act of searching through nothingness feels strangely profound. The civilization's true epitaph isn't carved in stone but exists in the collective shrug of historians who can't decide whether Boravia was a cautionary tale or the most enlightened society to ever exist. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps, as the Boravians themselves might say, if they could be bothered to say anything at all, it doesn't really matter either way. Chapter 31. Boravian cuisine, or how to make starvation seem like a lifestyle choice, ****. The culinary traditions of Boravia were less a cuisine and more a prolonged exercise in how little flavor the human palate could tolerate before ceasing to register food as edible. Their signature dish, mash, was a substance that occupied the precise midpoint between solid and liquid, made by boiling turnips until they lost the will to maintain structural integrity, then seasoning the resulting slurry with a pinch of whatever dust happened to be on the table. Boravian bread was baked to the consistency of shale as a preservation method, not to keep it fresh, but to ensure no one would be tempted to eat it unless truly desperate. Their only known condiment was grey salt, a mineral deposit that tasted vaguely of disappointment and was used primarily as a table decoration because applying it to food required too much effort. Festive meals differed from daily fare only in that the turnips were arranged in a slightly different pattern before being boiled into identical mush. Archaeologists excavating Boravian kitchens find utensils worn down from generations of stirring nothing vigorously, and storage pots containing residues that still, after millennia, smell like resignation. Modern food scientists attempting to recreate Boravian dishes report that the recipes seem designed to break the spirit before the teeth, a theory supported by the civilization's sole surviving cookbook, which opens with the instruction, "Consider whether you're actually hungry first," and ends mid-sentence with the word, "never mind." Chapter 32, Boravian Child Naming Conventions, or How to Ensure No One Stands Out Ever, ***. Boravian parents approach naming their offspring with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for labeling boxes in a basement flood. The most common names were all variations of Grum, for boys, Lem, for girls, and Thorpe, for children whose parents couldn't be bothered to check, with suffixes added only when absolutely necessary to distinguish between multiple siblings, resulting in household rosters reading like a stutter: Grum, Grumph, Grumthorpe, Grumthorple, etc. Names were selected not for meaning but for ease of being mumbled under one's breath, with the ideal moniker being one that could be spoken without fully opening the mouth. Twins were often given the same name to save time, while orphans were collectively referred to as "that one over there." The closest thing to a naming ceremony was the ritual of first sigh, where infants were presented to the village elder who would glance at them, exhale through their nose, and mutter something that might have been a name or possibly just a comment on the weather. In adulthood, most Boravians earned epithets like Grum who moved once, or Lem the slightly less slouched, though these were rarely used to their faces because that would require unnecessary conversation. Modern linguists note that Boravian names seem designed to be forgotten, a hypothesis supported by genealogical records where family trees consist of identical stick figures connected by dotted lines that occasionally trail off into nothing. Chapter 33, Boravian Hygiene Practices, or Lack thereof, ***. Cleanliness in Boravia was neither next to godliness nor anywhere in its general vicinity. Bathing was considered an eccentric hobby practiced only by the very young, who didn't know better, and the very old, who had forgotten better, with most citizens achieving personal hygiene through the passive method of waiting for rain. Their sole toiletry product was a lump of clay called scrubstone, that cleaned by abrasively removing layers of skin until dirt was no longer visible. Teeth were maintained through the chewing stick method, gnawing on twigs until either the teeth or the twig gave way, while hair was allowed to grow until it became sufficiently matted to form its own protective helmet. The Boravian approach to laundry was to wear clothes until they could stand on their own, then burn them in a ceremony called the Great Airing Out. Excavated latrines reveal that even their waste seemed lethargic, fossilized deposits showing layers of what appear to be centuries of barely differentiated strata. Modern microbiologists were shocked to discover Boravian gut flora had evolved to require minimal nutrients, a symbiotic adaptation to their diet, and even more shocked when those same microbes voluntarily died upon being introduced to modern food. The civilization's most impressive hygienic achievement was creating a society where no one noticed the smell because everyone had long since stopped breathing through their noses. Chapter 34, Boravian Elder Care, or How to Fade Away Without Disturbing Anyone, ***. Aging in Boravia was not so much a process as it was a gradual reduction in movement until one became indistinguishable from furniture. The elderly were neither revered nor abandoned. They were simply allowed to exist at decreasing levels of participation until they forgot to continue. Retirement consisted of being given the slightly more comfortable seat by the fire, which was really just a less uncomfortable rock where seniors would spend the days offering advice no one asked for in the form of monosyllabic grunts. The famed wisdom of the elders was mainly knowing which turnip patches were least likely to disappoint and remembering which years had been slightly less rainy than others. When an elder became too frail to feed themselves, the community practiced shared forgetting. Meals would be placed within reach until one day everyone forgot to do so, at which point nature took its course without fuss. Funeral rites were minimal because, as the Boravians reasoned, they wouldn't have wanted a fuss, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Modern gerontologists note with horrified fascination that Boravian elders showed none of the usual signs of aging-related distress, not because they'd solved senescence, but because they'd long since stopped expecting life to improve. The civilization's ultimate lesson about old age: if you never do anything, you'll never have anything to miss. Chapter 35, Boravian Weather Magic, or How to Fail at Controlling the Elements Without Really Trying, ****. The Boravian approach to meteorology was less about prediction and more about resigned acceptance dressed up as arcane practice. The storm priests performed rituals that mainly consisted of squinting at clouds while making vague hand gestures that might have been sacred symbols or possibly just arthritis acting up. Rain dances were theoretically part of their tradition, though surviving accounts suggest these were just regular dances slowed down until participants got tired and sat down, which, given Boravian movement norms, meant they barely qualified as movement at all. The most powerful weather-working artifact was the sky drum, an instrument played so softly it couldn't be heard over the wind it was meant to summon. Records mention a legendary, great drought-breaking ceremony that allegedly lasted 3 years, not because the ritual was complex, but because the priests kept forgetting what they were doing between steps. Modern climate historians have determined Boravian weather magic had exactly zero measurable effect on precipitation patterns, though it did coincidentally produce the most accurate long-term forecast method in the ancient world. If a priest predicted, probably more of the same, they were almost always correct. The tradition's greatest achievement was convincing neighboring tribes that Boravia's consistently mediocre weather was the result of deliberate mystical effort rather than cosmic indifference, a deception that required no actual deception, since no one cared enough to check. Chapter 36, Boravian Dream Interpretation, or How to Sleep Through Your Own Subconscious ****. While other cultures developed elaborate systems for analyzing dreams as messages from the gods or windows to the soul, Boravian oneiromancy boiled down to a simple axiom: if you remembered your dream, you hadn't slept properly. The dream dictionaries were blank scrolls that had been left out in case anyone needed to write something down. No one ever did. Night visions were classified into only 3 categories: turnip-related, common, slightly different, turnip-related, less common, and probably shouldn't have eaten that last helping of mash, rare but memorable. The closest thing to a spiritual vision in their tradition was Elder Grump's famous prophecy: there will be days, and then there will be other days, which was later enshrined as holy wisdom when everyone realized it couldn't technically be wrong. Sleep positions were studied not for symbolic meaning but to determine who had stolen the good sleeping spot by the fire again. Modern psychologists note with fascination that Boravians seemed to lack REM sleep entirely, a biological adaptation to a life so devoid of stimulation that even the subconscious couldn't be bothered to generate metaphors. The greatest contribution to oneirology, proving that the most restful sleep comes from having absolutely nothing to process. Chapter 37, Boravian Contract Law, or How to Make Agreements Without Commitment ****. Legal disputes in Boravia were resolved through a system called mutual sighing, where both parties would exhale heavily until one forgot what they were complaining about. Their contracts were written on deliberately fragile materials so they'd dissolve before anyone could be held to their terms, with clauses like, whatever seems easiest at the time, and subject to change if anyone asks. The famed Boravian handshake wasn't so much an agreement as it was two people simultaneously realizing arguing required too much energy. Property disputes were settled by having both claimants stand in the contested area until one wandered off to nap, at which point the land was awarded to whoever remained by default. Their only courtroom was a particularly flat rock where the judge, usually the village's lightest sleeper, would doze through testimony before rendering verdicts based on who had interrupted his rest the least. Modern legal scholars are torn between classifying this as the purest form of alternative dispute resolution or simply proof that laws exist solely because people won't stop bothering each other. The civilization's greatest contribution to jurisprudence, demonstrating that most conflicts resolve themselves if you ignore them long enough. Chapter 38, Boravian Metalworking, or How to Fail at the Bronze Age with Dignity ****. While neighboring civilizations advanced through copper, bronze, and iron, Boravian technology peaked at slightly sharper rocks. Their forges were less workshops than they were places to go when one wanted to stand near warmth without admitting to enjoying it. Excavated tools consist mainly of half-melted lumps that might have been arrowheads or possibly just rocks that got too close to fire once. The famed Boravian steel was later revealed to be ordinary iron that had been left outside so long it developed a patina of dignified resignation. Their most advanced metallurgical technique was waiting to see if it would cool on its own, a process that often took generations. The civilization's sole blacksmith, if one could call him that, was commemorated in a plaque that read, "Thorpe the Unhurried, he almost made a nail that one time." Modern materials scientists have determined that Boravian metal contained impurities not found in nature, not because of some lost alchemical secret, but because the smiths couldn't be bothered to properly refine ore. The greatest technological achievement, proving that society can function indefinitely at the good enough level if no one cares enough to demand better. Chapter 39, Boravian Maritime Exploration, or How to Discover That Water is Wet and Then Stop ****. Boravia's brief and disastrous flirtation with seafaring began when someone noticed the river Soper eventually emptied into something larger, and ended when everyone realized boats required maintenance. The shipyard produced exactly 3 vessels: a raft that sank under the weight of its own apathy, a canoe that was abandoned halfway through hollowing when the logs started looking too comfortable to disturb, and the infamous floating hut, a structure so heavy it created its own tides. The Boravian concept of navigation was to drift downstream until the scenery became unfamiliar, at which point they'd declare they'd gone far enough and walk home. Their sole maritime tradition was the ceremony of the damp oar, where would-be explorers would dip a paddle in water, stare at it for several hours, and then claim to have seen all there is to see. Modern marine archaeologists still debate whether certain coastal rock formations are natural or the remains of Boravian docks, a term used loosely to describe places where people gave up on sailing and left their half-finished boats to rot. The civilization's greatest nautical contribution, proving you don't need to explore the world when you're perfectly capable of being bored anywhere. Chapter 40, The Last Word on Boravia, which they would have skipped anyway, ****. After 80,000 words documenting a civilization that perfected the art of being forgotten, only one question remains: why does Boravia fascinate us? Perhaps because in a world obsessed with legacy, they achieved the impossible, a society that left nothing but the lesson that nothing is worth leaving. Their artifacts crumble upon contact with air. Their words dissolve into ambiguity, and their history slips from memory like a dream upon waking. They built no pyramids, won no wars, and produced no art anyone would cross the street to see. Yet here we are, centuries later, still poking at their ashes hoping to find, what? A meaning they deliberately avoided, a secret they couldn't be bothered to hide. The truth is simpler: Boravia fascinates because it shouldn't. A people who aspired to nothing, achieved nothing, and are remembered for nothing have, against all odds, become unforgettable. Their empty scrolls mock our need for narrative, their blank walls reflect our hunger for meaning, and their silent ruins whisper the one truth we spend our lives running from: that in the end, it's entirely possible none of this matters. The Boravians didn't just know this, they built a civilization around it. And that, finally, might be worth something. Chapter 41, Boravian Astronomy, or How to Study the Stars Without Looking Up*****. The Boravian approach to celestial observation was less about charting constellations and more about occasionally noticing that the sky existed when they tripped over something at night. The observatories were just slightly elevated patches of ground where one could lie on one's back without getting dirt in one's ears. The famed Boravian star charts consist of a single clay tablet with 3 dots that might represent Orion's belt or possibly just a scribe testing their stylus. Their astronomers, if one could call them that, classified all celestial objects into 2 categories: the bright one, the sun, and the other ones, everything else. Eclipses were dismissed as the sun being dramatic again, while comets were ignored entirely because looking for them required neck movement. The sole recorded astronomical discovery was when Elder Grumpf noticed the moon was in a different position than usual and immediately forgot about it. Modern astrophysicists have determined that Boravia's night sky was probably identical to everyone else's, they just couldn't be bothered to care. The greatest contribution to astronomy, proving the universe will continue to function whether you pay attention to it or not. Chapter 42, Boravian Mathematics, or How to Count Without Really Trying****. Numeracy in Boravia peaked at enough to know when turnips were missing, and plateaued there for centuries. Their numbering system had only 4 digits, 1 represented by a single line, 2 lines, many a squiggle, and enough a blank space. Fractions were considered dangerously innovative and thus banned after the Great Counting Schism of 1542 BCE, estimated date when 2 elders nearly came to blows over whether half a turnip should be represented by a broken line or just a shorter one. Geometry consisted entirely of recognizing that most things were vaguely round or sort of square-ish. The famed Boravian abacus had beads that didn't move because the frame was carved from a single piece of wood, not as a philosophical statement, but because making separate pieces required too much effort. Their most complex equation, scratched on the back of a pottery shard, reads, if turnip plus turnip equals turnip, why bother? Modern mathematicians note with horror that the Boravians somehow independently discovered, and immediately rejected, concepts like zero and negative numbers because they made thinking hurt. The greatest numerical achievement, developing a system where all calculations rounded down to probably fine. Chapter 43, Boravian Theatre and Performance Art, or How to Bore an Audience Before It Even Existed****. Dramatic arts in Boravia consisted mainly of villages reenacting particularly uneventful days from recent memory. Their most popular play, The Harvest That Was Adequate***, ran for 37 consecutive years because no one remembered to stop performing it. Stages were deliberately uneven to discourage energetic movement, while costumes were just regular clothes with occasional leaves pinned on. The Boravian concept of suspense was pausing slightly longer than usual between lines. The tragedies typically involved someone mildly inconveniencing someone else, the infamous "you ate my designated turnip" being the most controversial, while comedies were just tragedies where the characters sighed more frequently. The height of theatrical innovation was the non-rotation stage, where actors would stand in one spot until the audience got tired of looking at them and left. Modern performance scholars believe Boravian drama wasn't actually meant to be watched. It was an early form of protest art against the very concept of entertainment. Their most enduring legacy, the world's first and only completely motionless standing ovation. Chapter 44, Boravian Veterinary Medicine, or How to Ignore Animal Suffering Politely****. Livestock in Boravia were treated with the same quiet neglect as everything else. The animal healers practiced a unique form of medicine where illnesses were diagnosed by waiting to see if the creature got better on its own. It usually didn't. The famed Boravian sheep, a breed so listless it often forgot to graze, were sheared only when their wool became heavy enough to make them tip over. Cattle were trained to plow fields by following the path of least resistance, which often meant going in circles, while chickens were allowed to roost wherever they wanted because collecting eggs required bending down. The closest thing to veterinary intervention was the ritual, laying on of hands, where a sick animal would be gently patted until it either recovered or died, statistically about the same outcomes as doing nothing. Modern zoologists have determined that Boravian livestock evolved to require minimal care, a phenomenon now known as domesticated depression. The greatest agricultural achievement, proving that animals, like people, will eventually stop expecting better treatment if you ignore them long enough. Chapter 45, Boravian Winter Survival Strategies, or How to Hibernate Without the Energy, ****. Cold weather in Boravia was endured rather than defeated, through techniques modern survivalists call strategic resignation. The winter preparations consisted of sighing heavily when the first frost appeared and moving slightly closer to the fire. The famed Boravian snow shovel was just a flat rock that someone had once kicked out of frustration. Insulation was achieved by wearing all one's clothing at once and not moving enough to disturb the layers. Their most advanced heating technology, the shared warmth pit, was just a hole where people would sit close enough to exchange body heat but not so close as to require conversation. Frozen turnips were eaten as is because thawing them required energy no one could spare. The Boravian concept of winter sports was seeing who could grow the most impressive icicle beard, a competition that often lasted until spring. Modern climate researchers note with amazement that Boravian winter mortality rates were no worse than their neighbors, not because they developed effective strategies, but because their bodies had adapted to require so little sustenance that starvation took longer. The greatest cold weather innovation, proving hypothermia feels like falling asleep if you don't fight it. Chapter 46, Boravian Concepts of Wealth, or How to Be Poor Without Noticing, ****. The Boravian economy operated on what anthropologists call the principle of sufficient inadequacy, where everyone had just enough nothing that no one felt deprived. The currency was turnip IOUs that everyone understood would never be collected. The wealthiest citizen in recorded history was Elder Blort, who owned 3 turnips simultaneously for nearly a week before eating one out of boredom. Treasure hoards consisted of slightly nicer rocks arranged in patterns only the collector could appreciate, and even then, just barely. Inheritance laws were simple. When someone died, their possessions were left exactly where they were until someone else needed them more than they needed to not get up. Modern economists have calculated the entire kingdom's GDP as approximately 1 moderately stale turnip per capita per year. Their most enduring financial innovation, creating a society where bankruptcy was impossible because no one wanted anything enough to go into debt for it. Chapter 47, Boravian Responses to Crisis, or How to Wait Out Disaster Without Reacting, ****. When faced with floods, droughts, or invading hordes, Boravians employed their signature, horizontal resistance, technique, lying very still until the problem went away. During the Great Plague of 1321 BCE, approximate date, the standard treatment was, try not to cough near anyone important. When the river Soper flooded, villagers simply moved to slightly higher ground and pretended their old huts had always been underwater. Their military defense strategy against the Drausian invasion consisted of looking so unthreatening that the invaders forgot why they'd come. Modern disaster preparedness experts are torn between horror and admiration at how Boravians weathered catastrophes that toppled more advanced civilizations, not through preparation, but by having expectations so low they couldn't be disappointed. The greatest survival strategy, understanding that most crises resolve themselves if you live long enough to see them become someone else's problem. Chapter 48, Boravian Concepts of Progress, or How to Stay the Same Forever, ****. While other cultures measured advancement through technological innovation or cultural achievements, Boravia defined progress as not having to get up unless absolutely necessary. The Industrial Revolution consisted of realizing turnips could be eaten raw if one was sufficiently unmotivated. The famed Boravian wheel was a circular rock they occasionally kicked when bored but never thought to attach to anything. Written language persisted not to record history but because scratching marks into clay was less effort than remembering things. Modern developmental theorists have identified Boravia as the only known civilization to achieve perfect stasis, a society so content with inadequacy that even time seemed to move slower there. The greatest philosophical breakthrough, the realization that all human endeavor is ultimately pointless, so you might as well skip straight to the part where you stop trying. Chapter 49, Boravian Influence on Modern Culture or Lack Thereof, ***. Despite, or perhaps because of, the complete lack of achievements, Boravia has enjoyed an odd second life as a metaphor in contemporary thought. Management consultants cite Boravian efficiency when describing systems that barely function but do so consistently. The tech industry has embraced Boravian design, interfaces so minimal they repel users. A minor philosophical movement called Neo-Boravianism advocates for achieving enlightenment through strategic apathy, though it's struggling to gain traction because no one can be bothered to attend meetings. The only verified Boravian descendant in modern times is a reclusive Icelandic fisherman who, when interviewed about his heritage, replied, and went back to mending nets. Modern archaeologists still occasionally apply to study Boravian sites, though most abandon their research after developing what's known in academic circles as the Great Shrug, a sudden realization that some mysteries aren't worth solving. Their most enduring cultural impact, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of lowered expectations, and an aspirational model for anyone who's ever wanted to nap through history. Chapter 50, the final verdict on Boravia, which they wouldn't have read anyway, ***. After 100,000 words examining the most deliberately unremarkable civilization in human history, what conclusions can we draw? That Boravia was a failure? Hardly. They survived longer than Rome. That they were lazy? Not exactly. Maintaining that level of apathy across generations requires a perverse kind of discipline. No, the uncomfortable truth is this: Boravia succeeded. In a world where empires rise and fall through blood and fire, where cultures claw desperately for immortality through art and conquest, the Boravians alone achieved the impossible. They lived, they died, and they left behind exactly the legacy they intended to: nothing. No glorious ruins to be plundered, no grand philosophies to be debated, just the quiet whisper of a people who looked at the frantic striving of humanity and said, with one collective shrug, why bother? And in that, perhaps, lies their real lesson: not how to live, but how to stop pretending life needs to be anything more than what it is. A turnip, a sigh, a nap in the sun. The rest, as the Boravians knew, is just noise. Chapter 51, Boravian Concepts of Beauty or How to Be Unattractive Without Trying, ***. The Boravian ideal of physical appeal was best described as unobjectionable mediocrity. Their beauty standards revolved around qualities like being adequately symmetrical and not standing out in any noticeable way. The famed Boravian cosmetics were just faint smears of mud applied with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for wiping a dusty shelf. Hairstyles were limited to uncombed and slightly less uncombed, with the occasional daring soul sporting a mildly uneven braid during festivals before promptly giving up halfway through. The most sought-after physical trait was a face that didn't inspire comment, while their concept of seduction involved sitting near someone for several years until they grew accustomed to one's presence. Modern anthropologists have determined that Boravians were neither ugly nor attractive. They existed in a perfect quantum state of visual neutrality where observers' eyes simply slid off them without registering details. The greatest aesthetic achievement, proving that true beauty lies in not being memorable. Chapter 52, Boravian Concepts of Timekeeping or How to Measure Eternity in Yawns, ***. While other cultures developed sundials, water clocks, and calendars, Boravia measured time through a system called eventual certainty, where things happened when they happened, and wondering about when that might be was considered rude. The clocks were just rocks that occasionally got sunlight on them, while their calendar was a stick with notches that stopped being added around 1200 BCE because counting is effort. The Boravian hour was however long it takes to get mildly hungry again. Their week was several days, probably, and their year was marked only by the grudging acknowledgement that the turnips wouldn't harvest themselves. Historical records use relative dating like, shortly after that unremarkable rain, or, around the time Elder Grumpf forgot to finish his. Modern physicists studying Boravian timekeeping report disturbing phenomena. Clocks slowing down when near artifacts, researchers experiencing lost hours after reading certain scrolls, leading some to speculate the civilization accidentally discovered how to stretch moments into eternities through sheer indifference. The greatest temporal innovation, creating a society where punctuality was impossible because no one cared enough to be late. Chapter 53, Boravian Military Tactics, or How to Lose Wars Without Participating ****. Boravian warfare consisted of the 3S strategy, sit, sigh, and sometimes surrender. The army was just whichever villages were too slow to pretend they hadn't heard the muster call. Weapons were limited to sticks that had fallen naturally from trees and rocks that were already conveniently positioned on the ground, the Boravians considering it poor form to exert oneself by picking things up. The famed Boravian phalanx was a defensive formation where soldiers would stand close enough to share body heat but not so close as to require conversation. Their most successful battle tactic, the strategic nap, involved falling asleep mid-conflict until the enemy grew bored and left. Modern war colleges still study the Boravian retreat, a maneuver where soldiers wandered away at such a slow pace that opponents didn't realize they were leaving, as the ultimate in passive-aggressive disengagement. The greatest martial achievement, maintaining a perfect record of never winning a single battle, but also never technically losing one because no conflict ever officially ended, they just sort of petered out. Chapter 54, Boravian Poetry, or How to Make Silence Seem Eloquent ****. Boravian verse followed strict rules, no more than 3 words per line, no rhymes unless accidental, and absolutely no emotional content. Their epic poems had titles like Ode to a Slightly Less Bitter Turnip * and Meditation on a Rock That Hasn't Moved in Some Time. Meter was based on the natural rhythm of shallow breathing, while metaphors were discouraged as too exciting. The most famous Boravian poem, Untitled ***, consisted of a single blank scroll that the author claimed said everything that needed to be said. Modern literary critics argue whether Boravian poetry represents the ultimate refinement of minimalism or just evidence of widespread creative exhaustion. The greatest contribution to literature, proving that the perfect poem is one you forget immediately after hearing. Chapter 55, Boravian Child Discipline, or How to Raise Uncurious Children ****. Parenting in Boravia followed the 3 ignore policy: ignore tantrums until they stop, ignore questions until they're forgotten, and ignore achievements so no one gets ideas above their station. Punishments were limited to the disappointed sigh and being looked at slightly longer than usual. Their most severe disciplinary action, the silent treatment plus, involved not speaking to the offender until they apologized, a tactic that often lasted generations because everyone forgot what the original offense had been. Modern psychologists note with horror that Boravian children showed none of the usual developmental milestones, not because they were delayed, but because no one had bothered to record what normal was. The greatest pedagogical achievement, creating a society where, because I said so, wasn't an explanation but the entirety of moral philosophy. Chapter 56, Boravian Furniture Design, or How to Sit Without Comfort ****. Boravian furnishings followed the golden rule: if it couldn't be made by piling rocks on top of other rocks, it wasn't worth having. The chairs were just slightly flatter sections of ground, while tables were whatever surfaces happened to be at knee height when squatting. The famed Boravian bed was a pile of leaves that was never refreshed, gradually compacting over generations into a sort of organic slab. Modern ergonomic scientists have determined that every Boravian furnishing was perfectly designed to be uncomfortable in exactly 3 different ways simultaneously. The greatest design innovation, the multi-purpose rock, that served as chair, table, and pillow depending on which part of your body hurt the least at the time. Chapter 57, Boravian Concepts of Luck, or How to Not Care About Fortune, ****. Boravian spirituality held that fortune was neither good nor bad, just mildly inconvenient in new ways. The lucky charms were ordinary pebbles that had been stared at for particularly long periods. The concept of jinxing something was alien to them because anticipating outcomes required too much mental effort. Their most complex superstition was the belief that if you sighed 3 times before eating, the turnips might taste slightly less bitter. They didn't. Modern probability theorists have calculated that Boravians experienced statistically average amounts of good and bad luck. They just lacked the emotional range to notice either. The greatest metaphysical achievement, creating a society where whatever happens, wasn't a philosophical stance but an ironclad law of nature. Chapter 58, Boravian Elderly Fashion, or How to Dress for the Grave Slowly, ****. Aging Boravians signaled their seniority through subtle sartorial choices like wearing the same tunic for multiple seasons, and allowing moss to grow on one's left sleeve. The coveted elder sash was just a longer piece of twine used to secure one's robe, while the mark of true status was having enough patches on one's garments that the original fabric was no longer visible. Footwear for the elderly consisted of whatever had last been kicked off and not picked up again. Modern gerontologists note that Boravian aging fashion followed a perfect inverse curve. The older one got, the less effort one expended on appearance until achieving the ideal state of being dressed in what was essentially just a loosely arranged pile of rags. The greatest stylistic innovation, proving that true elegance comes when you stop pretending to care what anyone thinks. Chapter 59, Boravian Dental Hygiene, or How to Have Teeth Without Maintaining them, ****. Oral care in Boravia followed the natural detachment method, waiting for teeth to fall out on their own. The toothbrushes were just frayed twigs that had been chewed until they became slightly softer. The famed Boravian mouth rinse was plain water that had been left out long enough to develop what archaeologists delicately call ambient flavor. Modern dental anthropologists have discovered that Boravian teeth wore down at exactly the rate needed to remain functional until death, not through any preventative care, but because their diet of mush required no chewing. The greatest contribution to dentistry, proving that cavities can't hurt if you never eat sugar in the first place. Chapter 60, the final word on Boravia, because apparently we're not done, ****. After 150,000 words documenting history's most determined underachievers, one truth emerges: Boravia fascinates precisely because it shouldn't. In a world obsessed with legacy, they mastered the art of leaving none. Against humanity's desperate scramble for significance, they perfected the gentle art of not mattering. We study pyramids and revolutions while Boravia whispers its only lesson from the void, that all our striving might be just as meaningless as their not striving. They built nothing, they changed nothing, and in doing so, they achieved something no other civilization can claim: perfect contentment with oblivion. And so we close this volume not with a bang or a whimper, but with the sound of a single turnip falling in an empty field, making no sound at all because no one was left to pretend to care. Chapter 61, Boravian Concepts of Leadership, or How to Rule Without Doing Anything, ****. The Boravian political system was built upon the foundational principle that the best leaders were the ones who interfered the least, resulting in a governance model that modern political scientists describe as accidental anarcho-pacifism. Their kings were chosen not through merit or heredity but through a complex ritual called the sitting test, where candidates would remain motionless on a slightly uncomfortable rock until only one person hadn't wandered off out of boredom, this individual being declared ruler by default. Royal decrees were issued in the form of vague hand gestures that subjects were free to interpret however they liked. Most chose to interpret them as permission to go back to sleep. The famed Boravian tax system consisted of occasionally glancing in the direction of the royal storehouse while holding an empty basket, at which point villagers might, if they were feeling unusually motivated, toss in a turnip or two. Modern leadership experts have noted with horrified fascination that Boravia experienced 0 rebellions, 0 coups, and 0 political scandals, not because their system was just, but because no one could muster the energy to misbehave. The greatest political innovation, proving that the most stable government is one where no one cares enough to disrupt it. Chapter 62. Boravian textile production, or how to make clothing without enthusiasm. ****. The Boravian approach to fabric creation was less an industry and more a reluctant acknowledgement that nudity was occasionally problematic. The looms were just sticks propped against rocks with threads draped over them at random intervals, resulting in fabric that was neither woven nor unwoven but existed in a quantum state of probably good enough. Dyes were considered frivolous except for the occasional experiment with mud, which produced varying shades of damp. The famed Boravian winter cloak was just 3 regular tunics worn simultaneously with holes ripped for arm access, while their idea of formalwear involved wearing the same clothes as always but with slightly less visible stains. Modern fashion historians have determined that Boravian garments were perfectly designed to be uncomfortable in every possible position, whether sitting, standing, or lying down, thus encouraging the wearer to remain motionless for optimal results. The greatest sartorial achievement, creating clothing that made nudity seem like too much effort by comparison. Chapter 63. Boravian concepts of friendship, or how to socialize without interaction. ****. Relationships in Boravia were built not on shared interests or emotional bonds but on mutual tolerance of proximity. Their concept of best friends were people who could sit in silence together for years without feeling the need to speak. Social gatherings consisted of villagers occupying the same general area while pointedly ignoring each other, an activity known as companionable disregard. The height of Boravian intimacy was the nod of mild recognition, a gesture that could take decades to earn and might be revoked if someone changed their sitting spot. Modern psychologists have identified this as the purest form of low-maintenance friendship ever documented, relationships that required no nurturing because they had never really been alive in the first place. The greatest relational innovation, proving that the perfect friend is someone who won't notice when you pretend not to see them. Chapter 64. Boravian animal husbandry, or how to domesticate without trying. ****. Livestock in Boravia were neither pets nor products but rather roommates who happened to have hooves. The farming techniques consisted of opening gates and waiting to see whether animals would wander in or out, statistically about 50-50. The famed Boravian sheep were a breed so lethargic they often forgot to graze, resulting in wool that shed naturally in large, sad clumps. Chickens were allowed to nest wherever they pleased because collecting eggs required bending down, while cattle were neither milked nor slaughtered because both activities required getting up before noon. Modern zoologists have identified this as the world's first and only case of reverse domestication, where humans gradually adapted to animal schedules rather than the other way around. The greatest agricultural achievement, creating a society where the livestock were technically free range, but couldn't be bothered to range anywhere. Chapter 65. Boravian concepts of comedy, or how to not laugh at anything. ****. Humor in Boravia was so subtle it often couldn't be distinguished from despair. The jokes were mainly observations about turnips that weren't technically wrong. This one looks like all the others, but differently. The famed Boravian comedians delivered their routines in monotone while staring at the ground, with punchlines that trailed off into silence, the audience's cue to exhale slightly through their noses. Their most controversial comedic style, known as the long sigh, involved taking a deep breath and then not saying anything for several minutes, which somehow became funnier the longer it went on, or possibly just more uncomfortable. Modern humor theorists have spent decades trying to determine whether Boravian comedy was incredibly advanced or simply didn't exist at all, a debate that continues to this day, mainly because no one can muster the energy to resolve it. The greatest contribution to humor, proving that the perfect joke is one you don't bother telling. Chapter 66, Boravian Concepts of Wealth Redistribution, or How to Share Without Caring, ****. The Boravian economic philosophy could be summarized as, if someone wants something badly enough to take it from you, they probably need it more than you do. The banking system consisted of leaving surplus turnips in a slightly more central location than usual. Inheritance laws were simple. When someone died, their possessions were left exactly where they were until someone else needed them more than they needed to not get up. The famed Boravian tax revolt occurred in 1243 BCE, approximate date when someone moved the communal basket 3 feet to the left and no one could be bothered to move it back. Modern economists have calculated that Boravia achieved perfect income equality, not through policy, but because no one had enough energy to hoard resources. The greatest fiscal innovation, creating a moneyless society where poverty was impossible because no one wanted anything enough to steal it. Chapter 67, Boravian Concepts of Aging, or How to Grow Old Without Noticing, ****. The Boravian life cycle had only 3 stages: youth, when you could be forced to do things; adulthood, when you could ignore people forcing you to do things; and elderhood, when everyone ignored you back. Birthdays weren't celebrated so much as vaguely acknowledged through the ritual, sigh of recognition, a tradition that often continued for years after someone's death just in case. The secret to Boravian longevity wasn't diet or exercise but simple lack of stress. Their bodies deteriorated at the same rate as everyone else's, but no one cared enough to document the decline. Modern gerontologists were shocked to discover that Boravian elders showed none of the usual signs of aging-related distress, not because they'd solved senescence, but because they'd never expected life to be good in the first place. The greatest demographic achievement, creating a society where, over the hill, meant you'd finally reached the flat part where nothing happened. Chapter 68, Boravian Concepts of Home Decor, or How to Live Without Aesthetics, ****. Boravian interior design followed one simple rule: if you couldn't make it by piling rocks on top of other rocks, it wasn't worth having. The wall art was just discolored patches where the mud had dried differently, while furniture consisted of whatever surfaces happened to be at the right height when someone collapsed onto them. The famed Boravian hearth was just a slightly blackened patch of ground where fires were occasionally lit, but only if the wood had fallen within arm's reach. Modern archaeologists studying Boravian dwellings often can't tell where rooms began or ended because the civilization perfected the art of negative space, areas that weren't exactly decorated, but weren't exactly not decorated either. The greatest design innovation, proving that the perfect home is one you stop noticing the moment you enter. Chapter 69, Boravian Concepts of Crime and Punishment, or How to Maintain Order Without Effort, ****. The Boravian legal system was built on the radical principle that most crimes aren't worth stopping and most punishments aren't worth administering. The jails were just slightly less comfortable sitting areas where offenders were forced to contemplate their actions, a sentence usually abandoned when the guard forgot why they were guarding. The famed Boravian trial by ordeal involved waiting to see whether the accuser or accused got bored first and wandered off, statistically about 50-50. Petty theft was encouraged as it saved everyone the trouble of resource distribution, while violent crime was virtually non-existent because it required too much energy. Modern criminologists have determined that Boravia achieved near-zero recidivism rates, not through rehabilitation, but because no one could muster the enthusiasm to reoffend. The greatest judicial innovation, proving that the perfect legal system is one where everyone forgets how it works. Chapter 70, The Absolute Final Word on Boravia, We Mean It This Time, ****. After 200,000 words chronicling history's most determined underachievers, we arrive at the uncomfortable truth: Boravia won. While other civilizations rose and fell through blood and fire, while conquerors and philosophers fought desperately for immortality, the Boravians alone achieved the impossible. They lived, they died, and they left behind exactly the legacy they intended to: nothing worth remembering. No glorious ruins to be plundered, no grand philosophies to be debated, just the quiet whisper of a people who looked at the frantic striving of humanity and said, with one collective shrug, or don't. And in that, perhaps, lies their real lesson: not how to live, but how to stop pretending life needs to be anything more than what it is. A turnip, a sigh, a nap in the sun. The rest, as the Boravians knew, is just noise we make to distract ourselves from the inevitable. Chapter 71, Boravian Concepts of Music, or How to Make Silence Seem Loud, ****. The Boravian musical tradition was less an art form and more a prolonged exercise in how few notes could be played before an audience forgot they were listening to anything at all. Their instruments consisted of hollow reeds that produced a single pitch indistinguishable from wind passing through a crack, stretched animal hides that were technically drums but were struck so softly they may as well have not been played at all, and the controversial, not a fiddle, which most archaeologists believe was never actually played but was simply carried around for appearances during ceremonial non-events. Their compositions had titles like Variations on a Theme No One Could Remember ***, and The Song That Might As Well Not Exist ***, with lyrics, when present, consisting mainly of lists of household objects recited in descending order of usefulness, while their national anthem, preserved on a single wax cylinder that later turned out to be defective, was 3 minutes of someone breathing through their nose followed by what might have been a cough or possibly a failed attempt at percussion. Musicologists still argue whether Boravian performances were meant to be heard or were simply elaborate performance art about the futility of expression, though the civilization's sole musical innovation, the development of anti-harmony, where notes were carefully arranged to cancel each other out, resulted in a silence more profound than nature could achieve on its own, a metaphor so perfect it made visiting bards from neighboring kingdoms retire on the spot. Chapter 72, Boravian Concepts of Love and Marriage, or How to Form Bonds Without Enthusiasm ****. Romantic relationships in Boravia were built not on passion or commitment but on mutual tolerance of proximity over extended periods, with courtship rituals consisting mainly of standing near someone for several years until both parties gradually assumed they were probably married now, a process that could be accelerated if one partner happened to sit on the same rock as the other for more than 3 consecutive days. Weddings were brief, perfunctory affairs where couples would exchange identical lumps of clay, symbolizing something, though no one could remember what, before returning to their separate huts to think about what they'd just done, while divorce was unheard of not because marriages were happy but because filing the paperwork required getting up. The Boravian language had no word for passion, though it did have 14 subtly different terms for mild tolerance, with love poetry, what little existed, reading like grocery lists with occasional rhymes, your eyes are like turnips but slightly less round, I suppose you'll do, now please don't make a sound. Modern relationship experts note with horrified fascination that Boravian couples achieved a kind of perfect equilibrium, partners neither happy nor unhappy, simply existing in parallel like 2 rocks slowly eroding in the same unremarkable stream. Chapter 73, Boravian Concepts of Warfare, or How to Lose Without Trying ****. The Boravian military was less a fighting force and more a loosely affiliated group of individuals who had failed to hide quickly enough when the muster call went out. Their weapons consisted of sticks that had fallen naturally from trees and rocks that were already conveniently positioned on the ground, the Boravians considering it poor form to exert oneself by picking things up, while their armor was crafted from layered turnip sacks that provided no protection whatsoever but did exude a faint earthy odor that was said to have a calming effect on both wearer and adversary alike. Their most successful battle tactic, the strategic nap, involved falling asleep mid-conflict until the enemy grew bored and left, while their famed Boravian retreat, was a maneuver where soldiers wandered away at such a slow pace that opponents didn't realize they were leaving until days later. Modern war colleges still study the skirmish of Yawning Hollow, a conflict that began when a neighboring kingdom's patrol accidentally crossed into Boravian territory and ended when both sides, after a full day of standing motionless and staring at one another in silence, mutually decided to abandon the encounter due to sheer exhaustion, a victory the Boravians celebrated by taking an extra long nap. The greatest martial achievement, maintaining a perfect record of never winning a single battle, but also never technically losing one because no conflict ever officially ended, they just sort of petered out. Chapter 74, Boravian Concepts of Architecture, or How to Build Structures That Discourage Living, Boravian buildings followed three universal principles. Roofs should leak just enough to be annoying but not enough to justify repairs, doorways should be low enough to force visitors into a posture of resigned submission, and walls should be thick enough to muffle sound but thin enough to ensure no one ever felt truly alone with their thoughts. The famed architectural scrolls of Boravia, actually just a series of stick figures shrugging next to vaguely hut-shaped doodles, suggest their builders viewed structural integrity as more of a suggestion than a requirement, while excavations reveal foundations that appear to have been dug by people who lost interest halfway through and mortar mixed with what modern chemists have identified as probably some dirt they found nearby. The royal palace, if one could call it that, differed from peasant huts only in having a second room that no one ever used because getting to it required walking around an inconveniently placed support beam, while their sole architectural innovation was the load-bearing sigh, a technique where buildings remained upright not through engineering but through sheer lack of motivation to fall over. When structures did eventually collapse, as they all inevitably did, the standard Boravian response was to slowly blink at the rubble for several days before beginning to rebuild in exactly the same spot using exactly the same flawed methods, a cycle that continued for centuries without anyone ever questioning why. Chapter 75, Boravian Concepts of Medicine, or How to Cure Diseases by Pretending They Don't Exist. The Boravian approach to healthcare was simplicity itself. If an ailment wasn't immediately fatal, it wasn't worth treating, and if it was immediately fatal, it was too late to bother. Their medical texts, what few survived, consist mainly of drawings of frowning faces next to the word "don't" in various handwriting styles, while excavated healers' huts contain exactly two types of artifacts: unused herbal bundles that analysis reveals to be ordinary weeds, and small clay discs that may have been used for diagnosis or possibly just as makeshift coasters. The Boravian theory of disease held that all illnesses were caused by excessive vitality, and thus the best treatment was to lie very still until either the body forgot it was sick or the patient forgot they had a body, while their most advanced surgical procedure was waiting to see if it falls off on its own, a technique still employed in certain bureaucratic healthcare systems today. Childbirth was handled with characteristic Boravian pragmatism. Mothers were expected to just get on with it, while everyone else in the village pretended not to notice unless something went catastrophically wrong, at which point they'd sigh heavily before going back to whatever they'd been doing. Modern researchers note that the only condition Boravian medicine effectively cured was hope, a side effect that patients were expected to embrace as a feature rather than a bug. Chapter 76, Boravian Concepts of Sports and Recreation, or How to Move Without Exertion. Physical activity in Boravia was viewed with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for root canal surgery performed by a blindfolded bear. Their so-called games included such thrilling pastimes as seeing who could sit the longest without adjusting position, and the infamous turnip stare, where competitors would gaze at a single root vegetable until someone blinked or forgot what they were doing. Matches could last for days. The closest thing to a popular sport was mild shuffling, a team activity where participants would half-heartedly move between vaguely defined goals before collectively deciding it wasn't worth the effort and lying down instead. While equipment consisted mainly of sticks that had fallen naturally from trees and rocks that were already conveniently positioned on the ground, the Boravians considering it poor form to exert oneself by picking things up. Their Olympic equivalent, the Somnolympics, featured events like competitive yawning, synchronized sitting, and the 1 mm dash, often cancelled when no one showed up at the starting line, with winners receiving a slightly larger portion of that day's turnip ration, a prize most immediately traded away for the privilege of being left alone. Modern kinesiologists studying these athletic traditions report unprecedented drops in heart rate among test subjects attempting to replicate them, with several study participants falling asleep mid-experiment. Chapter 77. Boravian Concepts of Parenting, or How to Raise Uncurious Children. Child rearing in Boravia followed the 3 ignore policy: ignore tantrums until they stop, ignore questions until they're forgotten, and ignore achievements so no one gets ideas above their station. Punishments were limited to the disappointed sigh and being looked at slightly longer than usual, while their most severe disciplinary action, the silent treatment plus, involved not speaking to the offender until they apologized, a tactic that often lasted generations because everyone forgot what the original offense had been. Education consisted of elderly villagers mumbling folktales about moderately successful turnip harvests of yesteryear to children who had already mastered the art of sleeping with their eyes open, ensuring that each generation inherited not knowledge but a profound sense of resignation, a quiet understanding that curiosity was not so much discouraged as rendered impossible by the sheer weight of collective apathy pressing down upon them like an eternal, invisible fog. Modern psychologists note with horror that Boravian children showed none of the usual developmental milestones, not because they were delayed, but because no one had bothered to record what normal was, while the greatest pedagogical achievement was creating a society where "because I said so" wasn't an explanation but the entirety of moral philosophy. Chapter 78. Boravian Concepts of Fashion, or How to Make Sackcloth Look Like a Philosophical Statement. Clothing in Boravia followed one simple principle: if it couldn't be made by folding a single piece of undyed fabric around the body and securing it with a piece of twine found on the ground, it wasn't worth wearing. The textile industry consisted mainly of waiting for sheep to shed naturally and then vaguely gesturing at the wool until it resembled something that could legally be called a garment, while the Boravian color palette, if one could call it that, ranged from dirt to slightly darker dirt, with the occasional adventurous soul sporting a muted beige that qualified as scandalously flamboyant. Footwear was considered an unnecessary affectation except during winter, when everyone wore the same style of shapeless felt boot that somehow managed to be simultaneously too tight and too loose, while jewelry consisted of small, unremarkable stones tied around the neck with string, not as decoration, but as a practical reminder of where one's neck was in case it needed scratching. The closest thing to fashion innovation was the reversible tunic, which was identical on both sides because turning it inside out required too much effort, while modern attempts to recreate Boravian clothing for historical reenactments inevitably fail when the actors, after wearing the outfits for more than 20 minutes, develop an overwhelming urge to sit down and give up on life. Chapter 79. Boravian Concepts of Time, or How to Make Eternity Feel Brief. While other ancient cultures developed elaborate calendar systems tracking celestial cycles and agricultural seasons, the Boravians measured time in units called mares, roughly equivalent to however long it takes to stop caring about whatever just happened. Their clocks, when they bothered with them, were sundials deliberately placed in shadow or hourglasses filled with sand so coarse it barely trickled, while the Boravian week had one day called today, their month was however long it's been since someone mentioned the moon, and their year was marked only by the grudging acknowledgement that the turnips weren't going to harvest themselves. Historical records use relative dating like, shortly after that unremarkable rainfall, or, around the time Elder Grumph stopped talking mid-sentence and never started again, a system that reached its logical conclusion when scholars realized the Boravians had somehow missed an entire century because no one noticed when the long count calendar rolled over, an event that would have been accompanied by great fanfare in other cultures but in Boravia warranted only a single scribbled note that read, "Digits got stuck, might fix later." Modern physicists studying Boravian timekeeping report disturbing phenomena: clocks slowing down when near artifacts, researchers experiencing lost hours after reading certain scrolls, leading some to speculate the civilization accidentally discovered how to stretch moments into eternities through sheer apathy.